In this episode, we welcome Joey Dumont. Joey Somebody is self-proclaimed recovery douchebag. Hi, everyone. I am Lorianne. I am that gal from Milton, Ontario, Canada, and I am with...
I am that guy. I am Roy Miller from Dallas, Texas. Welcome to our Lift Your Story podcast.
In this episode, we welcome Joey Dumont, and I love this. Joey says that he's Joey Somebody and a self-proclaimed recovery douchebag. So thank you for being here with us.
Thanks for having me, guys. Great to be here.
So, what prompted you to write your book?
Well, one of my best friends was killed in a car accident in 2017. And his wife called me and asked me if I would write the eulogy. And then she asked if I would make it Joey funny. And I said yes. And she said, it's a very dark day for the church, but I want people to laugh, and I know how much you loved him. And so as I sat and wrote the eulogy, Jay's my buddy who passed away. His kids were 19 and 21 at the time. And my little boys were 6 and 4. And as I wrote, I realized that if this same fate were to befall me, my little boys wouldn't know who I was. They would know all the good stuff. My wife would say, your daddy loved you so much. He was the coach of all your teams. He spent all of his time with you. He was a good husband. He was a good friend. He had a really good run in the advertising business but all the good stuff. But they wouldn't know exactly who I was and all the decades long struggle with my insecurity, which was kind of fostered by my father, who happened to be a sociopath. And so I decided, and then The Life and Times of a Recovering Douchebag was a very accurate description of many of my escapades over the years. And so I thought that the book would be a very good foundational understanding of their daddy. It's not ready for them yet. They're 9 and 8. One just turned 8. But in their teenage years, they'll read it and they'll understand, oh my God, that's my daddy. And so that was the idea behind the book.
Yeah. Yeah. So you had a lot of childhood trauma growing up. And
Yes, sir.
I can empathize with you, but it sounds like that you made a conscious effort not to repeat that to your
Indeed.
kids.
Indeed. And I've actually used the vernacular that we broke the chain. So my older brother, who is single, he's an academic, law professor, very cerebral cat, spends a lot of time with my little boys. So 3 to 4 nights a week, he's here. He helps them with their school. He babysits every time my wife and I go anywhere. And as we talked about, and we're very close. He's 11 months older than I am. We decided that we wanted to raise our little boys, and I use that pronoun a lot with my brother. We'll raise our little boys the way we wanted to be raised. And so not only does my 2 little boys have a loving mommy and daddy, they have a very doting uncle who spends all of his time and energy on them. And it's a very quiet home because we're in love, and because I grew up in a house full of alcohol and screaming and yelling and door slamming and divorce and remarriages. I thought it would be best not to repeat that and to raise my little dudes in a loving, quiet home full of education and discipline and sports and music and books. And that's exactly what we're doing so far. So it has been great. And that was my biggest accomplishment in life to date, is these happy, well-adjusted little dudes who play sports and have a lot of friends and have a lot of fun and a lot of discipline, because discipline is love.
And plus, you're there for them.
Yes. All the time.
They've got your attention.
Exactly.
And they know
love is attention.
Exactly. I just fixed to say that. That's love, right?
Yep. Love is attention. Attention is presence, and presence is peace of mind. And another thing there is that when people ask me, what's the most important thing for your kids? What do you want for your kids? That's my answer. It's peace of mind. I want them to have a brain that regulates properly and that they can react to the world of suffering, because it's out there. And as much as I want to protect them from it, at some point we need to start to expose them to these things, and they're suffering out there, and they're old enough now where they're asking questions. You know, when we drive, I live in San Francisco, and when I drove them to soccer camp this morning, we drive through an area called the Tenderloin, and there's a lot of suffering there. There's a lot of people on drugs. There's a lot of homeless people, and they see that, and they understand when they drive from the hill in which they live upon down to the soccer fields, they see it. And so we're having these conversations now, and that's, as a daddy, you want to expose that to them just in digestible chunks, not too much too fast, because it can be overwhelming for their little brains. But yeah, they get it. They'll get it. They're starting to understand.
Yeah, but they're starting to understand.
Yeah. Yes, they are.
So I liked what you were saying prior to us getting on here about not making yourself into a victim, because that is something that happens to a lot of people. And it's really great to hear that, because there's two choices in life, right? Live as a victim or overcome it, and not let yourself be one. So do you want to speak a little bit more to that? I think that's important for people to hear.
Sure. I think, and it's not that I didn't live as a victim. I when I was younger, I distracted myself. And then as I became successful, heavy quotes, I had a really good run in the business world. And when you have the wherewithal to do things, you can distract yourself from your pain. And in my choices were material possessions, German cars, expensive watches, suits, travel, penthouses, whatever the situation was. And it was all a distraction. And so that was part of the douchebaggery that I illustrated. The victim consciousness side, as I started to grow up, was I can't distract myself from my pain anymore. And when I did realize that I needed some help, I went to a very highly trained and highly recommended clinical psychologist. And I sat in front of her for about 8 years, every Wednesday at 5 o'clock. Dr. J was her name. And she didn't save my life, but she made it so much better. She was one of those people that introduced me to that and said, hey, you can say that the rest of your life is now dictated upon the abuse, and you have a great excuse. But, do you want to live that way? Do you want to live? And I was like, live what? She said, live. Most people actually go through life without living. And if you're distracting yourself because of your abuse, let's deal with that. And that's where, the proverbial put your head in the dragon's mouth, deal with the triggers that caused the trauma, deal with the memories that caused the issues. And then once you start to unpeel that, and it's painful. It wasn't fun. The introspection wasn't fun. The therapy wasn't fun. But it turns out that, and this is, if I can encapsulate 8 years of therapy, it's that pause button. It's before you get mad, before you get emotional, is that you can respond if you think, it's that your hippocampus gets really upset, it's going to just boom, trigger. And so you jump out, or you get mad, or you get riled up. And that's where that victim consciousness can really be a deterrent to moving forward. And you can collapse inside that, because your ego is okay as long as it can identify with something. And if it can't identify with any success you're having because you're such a mess, it can totally identify with being a victim. And that's a really dangerous place to live. And if there's anything I can tell anybody around victim consciousness, is that you got to get out of that. You got to crawl out of that, because it can ruin you.
Yeah, for me, I was able to just lock mine in a box, put it aside. And when I had kids, I would never do anything in anger, ever.
Smart.
If they just said, hey, go to your room, I would calm down, think about it, and remember what it was like for me, and try not to perpetuate that, and then bring them in there and try to talk to them and deal with them, rather than go to the extreme or the other.
Yeah, I'm with you. That's great. Good for you too. Your kids.
I also like
it.
that Roy did explain this in another one too, where his beautiful wife of 50 years this year, he also made sure that she kept him accountable, which I thought is absolutely brilliant. That is definitely a partnership.
Yeah. We started dating when we were in high school, and so she knew the stuff I was going through at home. And then we talked about, so if we ever have kids, if you ever see, if we get married, if you ever see me going this direction, let me know. So she'd say, hey, you're starting to kind of sound like your dad there, you know. And that would stop. That would, I mean, that would totally stop me. Oh,
Yeah.
wow, okay, you know.
Yeah.
So I know what you're saying. You know, you went to a counselor. That's great, but you know, you get that stuff out of the way, and like you say, for your kids, you know, you're thinking, you know, I'm doing what I wish was done to me.
Exactly. That is, and I always said that. I wish I missed my dad when I was a kid because he split when we were kids. When I was 8, my older brother was 9, and my little brother was 2. And then he came back into our life and abused us, which was nice. But it was just, it's weird when you have a parent that doesn't love you. And that's something I had to understand. And it was nice once I got to the therapy sessions to understand that sociopaths don't have the capacity. So it wasn't a personal thing, you know, and when you and you can remove that from your own person. Oh, it wasn't my fault. Oh, that changes things. That's good. You know, I feel better then. And it's something you have to unlearn as a kid. You don't ever anticipate that the people that brought you into this world don't love you and don't want to protect you. That's just completely an anathema to human psyche.
I mean, you always wonder about being a parent. Are you doing the right thing? You know, are you doing what's best? You know, and I'll just give you a little insight. When your kids get older, you may not ever know it when they're growing up, but they're going to come to you at some point and tell you how much they appreciate that, what it meant to them. Because you know, my son always told me, he said, Dad, you know, I always felt loved. I always felt safe and protected growing up. You know,
see, that's fantastic, and I'm hoping I hear the same thing from my little dudes.
Yeah, I'm sure you will. I'm sure you will.
It's cute how you call them that, my little dudes.
Yeah, I mean,
I remember once I called my children, I said, yeah, my kids, they go, don't you call your children that. That's a goat. I'm going, oh, sorry. You never know when you're going to offend somebody with what you call your children.
It's very true. I was on a Zoom call with it was a business call about pronouns and diversity training and all of those things. And I referred to my little dudes, and then someone said, oh, how old are they? And I said, oh, blah, blah, blah. And then I said, my little half-breeds, because my wife's Chinese. And man, this place went crazy. They were so mad at me. It was like, how dare you call your children half-breeds? That's a pejorative term. And I was like, okay, well, I didn't call your children half-breeds. I was just making a joke. And and I'm half Mexican and half French. So I always called myself a mutt, and I've called my kids little mutts. But, you know, I know. I don't know why I dived down that path, but I got in a lot of trouble. There was some real, and you don't say that on a diversity training program. I guess probably the lesson learned there.
Well, I was called a Heinz 50. I was called Heinz 57.
Yeah.
Well, because we are kind of all an amalgam of many things now. So.
Yeah. That's funny.
Yeah.
Sorry. That was good.
You know, I've got to ask you. So you said you're a stay-at-home dad.
Yeah.
Okay. And you know, there's a lot of that nowadays. But you know, how do your kids, how do their friends react to that, to your kids?
I don't think their friends know the difference yet. My little dudes don't even understand that daddies have jobs. So I've been home for 4 years now, and I coach their team. So their buddies just know me as Coach Joey, because I've coached basketball, baseball, and soccer. And so I don't think they know. It's kind of like, you know, your kids, when they ask you, what does your dad do? My kids are like, he wrote a book, because that's all they've seen me do for 3 years. My dad wrote a book, and they're like, oh, he's an author. And they're like, yeah. Does he get paid? I don't know. Daddy, do you get paid? And I'm like, oh, no, not at all. If it's the opposite, you know? And so it was just, they don't know, and they don't care. And I think that's another thing that's really important to understand as a parent, is that your kids are not impressed by what you do. They don't care what you do for a living. They care about spending time with you, and they care that you're kind to them, and they care that you're teaching them. And they just, to your earlier point, Roy, they want your attention. Mm-hmm. You know, I counted from breakfast to lunch how many times I heard, Daddy, 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 look, Daddy, Daddy, look. It was 100 times before noon. And so it was just this cacophony of daddies. And I started laughing. I'm like, what? I'm like, you guys said daddy 100 times in the last 3 hours. And it was, just an example of how wonderful children are, because they don't do anything except live in the present. There's no past, there's no future. And you can learn so much from being with kids. And I think that was the lesson for me. The last chapter of the book is called Coach Joey, because I wanted to chronicle how much I learned from kids. And that's when I was walking my little kids to school. We live in San Francisco, and they went to a school about 4 blocks from my house. And so I would walk hand in hand with my little guys down the sidewalk, and they would look at ladybugs and stop and pay attention. Daddy, look. And I was, oh, wow. You know what that is? And that's a ladybug. And this, what's this? And lots of roly-poly. And then the cable cars are driving by, and then they're waving to the people in the cable car, and the people in the cable car are helpless with how cute that is. And you're just sitting there going, man. And then there's birds. I've lived in this house for 20 years or in this neighborhood for almost 30. And I never paid attention to the birds when I was running an ad agency. I was busy. I was always in my head. This deal I had to close, or I had to hire this new person, or I have to fire this person, or whatever was going on in my brain. And as I walk around my neighborhood now, I always joke with my friends. I'm like, hey, you guys aware there's birds in the trees? And by the way, they sing. And I didn't even hear it. So like, I learned that from my little dudes, where it's like, Dad, pay attention to now. And that was the greatest thing about being a daddy and a stay-at-home daddy, is that I got all that time to learn from my little boys.
I do have to say something funny, because I was talking to my daughter yesterday. She's 27 now, but we were on the phone for about 5 hours. And I said to her, I said, you know what? She goes, why did you have me? Because she's not married with kids or anything yet. And I said, she goes, maybe you did just so that you can talk to your daughter. And I said, but the funny thing is I found when I had children, I would go out and buy toys that I wanted as a kid that I never got and play with them with those toys, because it was like, it brings out the child in you again that you forgot about, because like you said, your mind's so this. When you spend time with your kids, all of a sudden that kid comes out. And my ex-husband, who was very, mature, I mean, he would get down and we'd buy trains, and he'd be down on the ground with the kids playing with them. And I'm going, wow, I've never seen this before. And there's something beautiful about that.
Oh, no question. Legos is an example. The Lego sets that, we grew up poor, my brother and I. And so we didn't have, and again, my kids are spoiled, sadly, but the Lego sets are so intricate and cool that, it takes a long time to put them together. And then the games that we play, Risk is an old game we used to play. I don't know if you guys ever played
love
that.
Risk.
Yes.
And my kids love that. So, and it actually taught them geography a little bit, because they're like, oh, this is Asia. And you're like, yeah, this is where you guys came from, and this is North America. And so the board games are great, because you're just posited into this, present moment. You're just there, and they're there. And I remember I was still working way too much when Kingston, my oldest, was 18 months old. And I came home, and I got home, picked him up from daycare, and we came running in, and we started playing a game, and my phone was just, so I kept looking at it. And 18 months old, he goes, Daddy, no phone, just like that. And I was like, oh, dude. And so I took the phone and I put it away forever. I have never pulled it out after. When I hang out with him now, it just sits in the kitchen on its cradle. And obviously I don't have a job. So let me be clear. It doesn't work if you have a job, but it was just such a wonderful, hilarious moment, because 18-month-old child has no filter. And he made so much sense in those 2 words, no phone. It's just duh. And so that really helped me understand that I just need to be with them. And that's a big piece of it. And when I go back to work next year, I'm going to miss it. I'm going to miss being with them as much as I have been. But, now they're 10 and, well, not almost 10 and 8. And they have their soccer teams and their buddies. And so they're starting to get there where I'm not going to be that fulcrum to their existence anymore. So we'll see.
You're talking about being a coach with your kids and stuff. I've worked with kids, and it's amazing to me how many people drop their kids off, pick them up at practice, games, events. I was involved in Boy Scouts with my kids, and we used to have these, we call them a court of honor, where they got all their awards.
Yeah.
There was
I was
kids
way below.
went through there, and their parents never one time saw them get an award.
Oh, that's sad.
And so you think about your kids, you're right there. You're always been there. I mean, that is so huge to them now, but even as they grow older, my dad was always there.
And they know this is their mommy's gift, because I left the ad business. I left my ad agency in 2014 and went to a startup to be something called a chief revenue officer. And so the startup technology needed an executive who understood the advertising world. And so I launched into that. I worked my butt off for a couple of years, and then the company ran out of money, and it was a huge failure for me. I was very upset. I was sad that I couldn't pull it off, and obviously there's a lot of circumstances that led to the company's demise. But I remember sitting here watching Curious George and My Little Dudes, and I was jealous of the man in the yellow hat, because he had this cool penthouse in New York, and he had obviously had a place in the Berkshires or the Hamptons. I'm not sure what it was. And then he had a hang glider, and I'm like, God, that guy's killing it. And I just had to fire my whole team because we're broke. And that perceived failure was rough. And I remember talking to my wife, who was an executive and doing very well. And she said, babe, this is probably a good time for you to write that book you've been talking about. I said, yeah, no, I'll take the next year off and do it. Thank you. And she said, if you don't do it and you work 70 hours a week, like you have been, and you miss out on fatherhood, she said, I then have to live with you for the rest of your life while you're severely depressed because you actually did what your father did. And I was like, oh, babe, wow. And so I wasn't good. I was going to jump back into the corporate world because it was my ego. And I really liked being a provider, all the man stuff that I grew up with in Minnesota. My mom still to this day, why aren't you working, Joe? You're working off your wife. Your wife's supporting you. Are you okay with that? I'm like, I am. I'm totally good with it. But And then, so yeah, it was a gift from my wife, and my boys know that. We talk about that. Mommy made this possible, guys. She's carrying the weight, and it's been fantastic. And it was the greatest respite I've ever had. And now I'm looking forward to going back. As I think I mentioned earlier in our chat before the recording, is that I'm not going to go back and run another ad agency, but I am going to go and do some leadership coaching, specific to a lot of my colleagues. I have a couple clients already where they're senior leaders, CMOs, CEOs, head of divisions, and working too much, and they need some balance in their lives. And so if there's anything I learned by being home and writing a book and something that's introspective as a memoir, getting through some pain so that I don't have to suffer, and then understanding the importance of being present and understand the importance of being a parent. A lot of those lessons I think can be easily articulated in my coaching sessions. And then when I go out and do my speaking engagements at conferences, whenever the lights come back on in our culture, a lot of those stories I want to share with my fellow media colleagues, because they're stories that I think are beneficial to people for not only to hear, but to absorb and attempt to model at some level.
I was just going to ask you, I know this sounds really crazy, but it might be a good idea for you to get them all on a getaway. The plans, you just go away somewhere and just go bird watching.
Yeah. Bird watching is something I never thought about until I realized there were birds in San Francisco.
Right.
You were talking about your wife, and women are amazing of being able to have insights that you don't see.
Yeah.
And it's like my wife one time, she said, when you leave work, the kids are in bed. When you come home from work, the kids are in bed. If you're not careful, they're going to grow up and not know who you are. Yeah. And man, that's like hit me in the back of the head with the 2x4.
Yeah.
My life totally changed from that point on.
Well, good. You realized it before it's too late, because I have a lot of
Exactly.
buddies that are dealing with that now.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
they've had very successful corporate careers, but their kids are now in high school and they don't know 'em.
Yeah.
And they're sad. You know, you can't put that toothpaste back in the tube, you know.
No, no,
It's
because
just,
your kids grow up, and when they're gone, they're gone.
that's it. Yeah. Goes
Cat in the
fast.
cradle and the silver spoon.
Exactly. Exactly.
My dad, that's in my book. My dad gave me that album after he left. Can't believe it, but he did. Here you go. And I was like, did you listen to it? Like, do you
Yeah.
know what this song's about, dude? Like, come on.
Yeah, really.
Awesome
Yeah.
song.
Don't repeat the sins of your father. Yeah. It's a good
And you
mantra.
know, and honestly, you have to make a conscious decision not to do that.
Oh yeah. Yeah. With my massive ego, I could have easily got caught up in the work thing and then justified it. My kids need it. My
Yeah.
kids deserve this kind of a life. My kids deserve the bigger house. My kids deserve, you're like, no, dude, that's all on you, man. You want the bigger house and you want the new German car every 3 years. And no, that's you, dude. Hope you like your shit, because your kids don't like you.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know?
True. I see that. I've seen it. Yeah,
It's-
and
I
I
see
love
it all
what
the
you were
time.
saying too about your book, is that that your children will be able to read it at some point and understand it better. I don't know if we brought that up in this podcast. We were talking about pre-recording, and I think that's something that's a message that's worthwhile for our listeners to hear.
Yeah, I want them to understand that, you know, I'm not trying to prepare the road for my kids. I'm trying to prepare my kids for the road.
Exactly.
And I want them to know, and this book is part and parcel to that, is that there's suffering out there, a lot of it. And so what they can do with their platform of being lucky and having this, you know, doting parents and healthcare and all the neat things that they have that they don't understand yet. That's something that they'll, when they read my book, they'll be like, wow, man, you grew up like that? Yeah. Yeah. And you need to understand that there are millions, tens of millions of other people out there that grew up. And that's another reason the book I thought was so necessary to write, is that none of what I wrote about was atypical, specifically to most, you know, upbringings. There's 50% divorce rate just across the board, which means you're getting remarried, which means you have step monsters, you know, on either side. And you have alcoholism, and you have death by depression, and you have negligence, and you have sociopaths. And, you know, it sounds, you know, when you talk about that in an amalgam, it's like, wow, that's really bad. You're like, yeah, but none of the stories are isolated and or separate of a lot of other people. And again, tens of millions of folks go through this. So the idea, and then when the book reviews came out, it was very similar. It was, I laughed, I cried, I cringed, I rooted for Joey, and people would say things like, I had that same thing. I remember the door slams. I remember the remarriages. I remember the alcoholism. And I had a couple of buddies that say, you know, you described alcoholism so well in chapter 2 or chapter 3. It just hit home. And I was like, yeah, because anyone who's lived with an alcoholic knows what that's like. And the normatives are very, very there. It's not like, you know, alcoholics and drug addicts and abusers and, you know, the people that I grew up with, my dad and my stepfather, it's not atypical, which I think is part of the sad part. But I think if you can, another reason for the book was to let people know that they're not alone. It makes them feel less alone when they read stories about other people who've gone through some stuff, and then how they came out of it, and then how they can actually hear the birds at some point.
Yeah. Well, it's like when my kids were growing up, they always go, Dad, how come Papa doesn't even talk to you? I said, don't worry about it. You don't need to know anything about that, you know. And you know, they'll say, well, you know, when you're growing up, and I said, you don't need to know any of that stuff.
Yeah.
You don't need to know any of that stuff. Don't worry about it.
And listening to this, I do have to put a shout out. I thank God for my parents. My mother was a stay-at-home mom. My dad did the best with 4 daughters to spend as much time as he could with us. He was the funniest guy. Every Christmas morning, he was a bigger kid than us. And those are the things I remember. So
Yeah, that is what you
Yeah.
remember. You remember the time together.
Yeah.
And we just did that. We took our little boys on a escapade. We went to, my wife grew up in Austin, Texas. And so we drove the kids in an RV. Yes,
Texas.
right next to you. And so we rented an RV for the first time. We drove, took 8 days and went to the Grand Canyon and Sequoia National Park and a couple other national parks and had a wonderful time, campfires and s'mores and all this neat stuff. And it was epic. And it was so great because they loved every minute. You know, we hung out in the RV together and we watched, you know, Incredibles 2 and, you know, Sandlot and those kind of movies as we were eating our cheeseburgers and our hot dogs. And, you know, they'll never forget that. And I'll never forget that. You know, those kind of moments are forever. And we're, as my wife and I said, we bought memories with this vacation. That was what it was about.
Okay, I have to just say this. Now, I can't believe you came to Texas and you actually left to go to California.
I will say this: I love Texas. It's a hell of a state. But I don't miss the heat. I don't miss the heat. It was 104, I think, when we left, and I got back to San Francisco and it was 67, and I was like, "Yes, this is my city.
Yeah,
I'm not melting anymore."
I will say San Francisco is one of my favorite cities. I lived in Reno, Nevada for 3 years. That's where my oldest son was born. And I used to just love, because my ex-husband traveled a lot, and I used to just get my backpack, take him, and I would walk up and down the streets of San Francisco because it was only 3 hours away, 3.5, something like that.
Yeah.
It was a beautiful city.
I spent the summer there with my aunt and uncle when I was 11 years old. And yeah, I had a lot of good memories about San Francisco.
Yeah,
well, they lived in San Leandro actually, but just right across the bridge. But yeah, first time I got to see the ocean, the Golden Gate Bridge, Alcatraz, and while I was there, 3 convicts escaped from Alcatraz. They never found them. But,
yeah, no, that was a movie.
that actually
Alcatraz. Yeah,
I was there.
You were there. Wow.
So Joey, how can our listeners get your book?
It's on Amazon.
Okay.
And if you just look up Joey Somebody, it usually pops up, but you may have to punch in the actual subtitle, which is The Life and Times of a Recovering Douchebag. And then I have a podcast called Joey Laugh Your Cry Out with Joey Dumont.
Oh, cool.
And on the podcast, I interview many different guests, but it's anything from masculinity, mental health. This last week, I interviewed 2 professors about a very controversial topic called safe space and mental health on campuses and those kind of things. And so that was a very interesting topic that I enjoyed doing some research on. But yeah, it's called Laugh Your Cry Out with Joey Dumont. And that's the best way to get any content that I've put out there, including my book.
Great.
Beautiful. We really appreciate this. This was just absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your story.
Well, thanks for having me on, guys. I appreciate it.
Would you be interested in coming back sometime?
Sure. Anytime.
Perfect. Well,
Well, your answers should be no, I'm not interested. Why would I want to come back again?
I don't really like you guys. I don't think I really want to come back. Yeah.
I gave you everything I know, guys.
That's good.
No, this is great. Thanks again.
Yeah,
You're very
thanks so much, Joey. Really enjoyed meeting you.
You too,
Absolutely.
man. Thanks a lot, guys.
All right. Bye.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Be sure to visit us at lifterstory.com.